Okay, so we went through some of this. I'm just going to review a little bit of what we already went through and then just jump into the parts that we didn't get to go through in class. So, some argue that the link between masculinity and war is quite literal, that men who are often in charge of these aggressive military conquests will actually build larger and larger phallocentric weapons to kind of one up each other in an international pissing contest of sorts, right? And I told you how, like, there's this local punk band that has, like, the best song about that ever. They're called Division and it's called War and it's the best song ever. But anyway, of course, this is a super oversimplification of complicated geopolitical conflicts. But some research we discuss in the book examines how these leaders think and articulate around war in very gendered and sexualized ways that make this link seem more credible. So, this doesn't really mean um, that they're really including in this because again, it's this hyper simplistic, pissing contest metaphor, which really doesn't take into account, institutional violence. Um, the fact that the state itself engages in certain projects that create violence. So anyway, it doesn't really encapsulate an actual dialogue, but it's kind of funny. So, we have endless films and TV shows about the heroic nature and carnage and brutality of war, where men prove themselves on the battlefield. And we see this as a specifically masculine enterprise, as most of these films focus on wars in which women were prohibited from service or often combat, frontline combat. So being a soldier is analogous with being strong. So other masculine qualities that we value, that strength, bravery, you know, um, lacking fear, all of those kind of things. But war today is very different than these kind of, TV/movie depictments of this idealized notion of what it used to be in the past. Today, a lot more combat takes place on a computer, right? That you press a button, you control a drone. There's less of this actual engagement on the ground. So this is very counter to our notions of war and soldiers that are very constructed around this archetype of like a very muscular dude that goes out and kicks ass or whatever. So obviously masculinity is related to the political arena, and this is something that's not new. This is something that's been going on throughout our history. So for many years women were excluded from politics, and this is part of that separate spheres ideology, right? Because the world outside the home was considered too aggressive for women because they were considered too weak and emotional, to be suited for the male world of the outside, which included the world of politics. So when it comes to war and manhood within presidents that we've had over time, there's a lot of history as far as, presidents. A lot of these presidents themselves have been in the military. And of course, how willing they are to go to war is supposed to be has a relationship to manhood. So, what's interesting is the book gives this example of Johnson, President Johnson, when people were criticizing how he was handling Vietnam. He criticized their masculinity. He questioned, their sexualities. He once said after bombing North Vietnam, that quote, he didn't just screw Ho Chi Minh, I cut his pecker off, end quote. So there's that. Um, right? I mean, that's pretty closely related to gender and sexuality, really, when it comes to those kind of quotes. So you can't make that kind of stuff up. It's just too perfect into the kind of analysis they're making of the gendered language supporting these aggressive military conflicts. So, this idea of impotence or conquering or destroying one's enemy often kind of lies within the same language and words and understandings of dominance and conquest that we apply to the masculine identity in general, right? So anyway, there was also this ethnographic research in the book that talked about how, military defense people, the language that they would use when they were talking about military conquest, they'd talk about, quote, soft laydowns, right? Deep penetration or spasm attacks, right? So the women that were doing the research would kind of glance at each other and laugh and be like, did they just say that? Did that just happen? But No one else seemed to really notice in the room. So other research looked at how gender plays a role into military policies themselves. So there was an example how the kind of narrative that we have around wars and understandings are often very gendered. It comes from this very like that Toby Keithish "will put a boot in your ass, it's the American way" kind of thing. But you know this idea of putting something up someone's ass. I mean, let's be real. There's this kind of dominating, masculinizing logic of like, what is the most dehumanizing? What is the most degrading? It's like we talk about the hierarchy, right? So for a man, if they're at the top of this very heteronormative, gendered hierarchy, then being dominated, or if you interpret that as penetration, is somehow counter or challenge to that dominance and masculinity. So really just this idea that we often see, like during the Gulf War there was bumper stickers that said USA, which stood for up Saddam's ass. Like there's often these kind of we'll put a boot in your ass kind of things that yes, they're colloquialisms. Like I don't think we really figuratively and literally mean shoving a boot in someone's ass, but at the same time it's really this kind of gendered and sexualized idea of degrading a person through domination. So these military conflicts don't take place in a vacuum. They take place in a culture that values violence and aggressiveness as a form of displays of masculinity. So it's commonly accepted that the state itself requires the use of violence. So, in order to maintain, a certain amount of politics or policies, or, kind of like our international agreements and politics, there needs to be some sort of military force and police and some sort of violence that maintains that state. And by there needs to be, I'm not at all arguing that that should be a thing. I'm just saying that that is the structure of the system that we do have. So, in our social conception of this state violence, we equate violence and masculinity in this very kind of strong American ethos, right? So part of this American, fighting war and fighting, military kind of conquest has always been linked to this kind of masculine um, identity. So a lot of our respected cultural heroes were soldiers, for example, or at least actors that played them in movies. So this code of violence is not something that's new. This is something that became a norm around the 18th century. And this largely came from some of my ancestors who, specifically Scottish and Irish immigrants who came as cheap labor, right, to the US as, the boom of industrialization happened. And they moved to the South and established this norm of brawling or dueling. So basically, fighting, hunting, drinking, that became this way that men in the South started to express their manhood. So this has created a cultural legacy of violence to American life. So this can be seen in the fact that violence has always been the highest in places where young men gather together, especially if they're away from what they call the civilizing effect of women. So where men tend to, especially young men, tend to gather is where you see the uh, the most violence. So there's this history, and I think this is a really interesting history. Like I'd always heard of the concept of having a chip on one shoulder, but of course it was just much more metaphorical, I guess. Like I didn't realize that they meant like literally, but I guess it just means we use it to mean as a colloquialism when someone is walking around looking for a fight. So when Margaret Mead was understanding, doing research on American violence, she found this pattern where Americans would, refuse to initiate aggression, but they have this willingness to retaliate that far outscales the actual initial aggression. So if that makes sense. So like if someone barely scuffs your shoe, you punch them in the face, right? So like you basically take any small slight thing as a disrespect towards you and your person, and that gives you the justification, the right, the legitimacy to use violence against that person. So having a chip on one shoulder it's really interesting, this kind of history of it, that, basically people would literally put a piece of wood on their shoulder and, basically walk around like that, challenging people to knock it off. Meaning, so if someone knocked that chip off of your shoulder, you would fight them. So walking around with a chip on your shoulder then kind of just came to mean looking for a fight. But that's really what it is looking for the justification, the social justification for a fight. Because having a chip on your shoulder, if someone knocks that off, you have the right to retaliate with a lot more aggression that is far out of proportion of the original offense. And so, we're a nation of people who say, well, I don't want to start a fight, but I'll finish it, right? It's definitely part of our cultural ethos. So, this is not a new social phenomenon. And the book talks about how boys are often encouraged to fight. And it was considered central to establishing a boy's male gender identity in their childhood. So the book has this example of a parenting book from the beginning of the 20th century that said it is normal for a boy to fight once a day. So, like, every day at school, they should get in at least one fight. One fight seems good. You're like, that's insane. So imagine the kind of chaos that would create in our kind of our world if in elementary school, at least once a day, you got in a fight, right? Every boy, not just some, but every boy. And so, there was this kind of idea that boys should be a certain amount of violent. And also the first week of school, it was expected that boys should fight more, right? So boys who were not violent would not grow up to be real men. This was the fear, what they called the specter of the sissy, this kind of fear of emasculation, of humiliation, and effeminacy that American men carry with them because of our social understandings of manhood. I mean, we've talked about this a lot before, the hierarchy, the idea that anything that's considered masculine is a devaluation of anything considered feminine. So if a man does anything that could be considered feminine, whether it's in his gender or sexual performance, it's considered deviant because you're going down the social hierarchy. You're challenging the hierarchy, right? People don't like that. So this whole fear of this sexuality being linked to gender and sexuality, because it's really the confluence of gender and sexuality that they're talking about with the kind of concept of sissy, right? It's the non-normative gender performance for men. And so that's kind of like this fear at the time. Like, if your boy's not fighting enough, maybe he won't be a real man when he grows up. And that kind of definition of a real man, of course, very hyper masculine. So this code of violence is something that seems to separate men and women in society. So the contemporary version of this can be seen in this legacy from old Southern notions of honor. So, if a man was challenged by another man, he would have to fight him, because of his honor, right? But some of the language and understandings of this have changed, but it's kind of kept as a persisting cultural pattern. So by the turn of the 20th century, we called it a reputation, right? You had to defend your rep if someone challenged it. By the 50s, Black people that were living in impoverished neighborhoods called it respect, or not showing disrespect, or dissing. Oh, that person dissed me, that person, disrespect me. That's a reason to use violence, right? Or to kind of have to challenge someone to a fight. The idea is if someone does that to you, you now have to fight them in order to preserve your whatever you want to call it. They changed that notion over time from respect to whatever, but really just means your masculine honor, really. So, we can see how it's the same concept, changed a bit over time, but it helped us construct a social code of violence in our culture. So, masculinity is still often equated with the capacity for violence. Think about representations in the popular culture. Men who are muscular and able to exact their dominance are celebrated as real men. Our culture is rife with these images, and this reinforces these kind of cultural notions of manhood that we've had for generations in this culture. They just get recycled, and if anything, they become more and more precise. So research shows that young Southern white men are more prone to violence than other men from other regions of the US. In the study, they set up a challenge for men who had to walk through a hallway and be slightly disrespected. So basically, you'd walk through and someone would try and pull out a drawer and they couldn't because you walk by and they'd be like, asshole, or something like that. And then, they measured people's reactions by their faces, by, what they did in response, etc. And so for many men, there was no reaction at all. Or sometimes they were even amused by it, like, ugh, this guy. But for people that were from the South, they were more likely to react with violence to this very, very simple provocation. So, of course, this is the result of cultural differences. In the South, people are driven by this code of honor, meaning that masculinity is linked to your ability to wield violence, which it really is everywhere, and defend your honor from challenges, but it's much more pronounced in the cultural value system. So, men learn that violence is an accepted form of communication among men and between women and men. So, we often accept this reality as common within families, between friends, between lovers. Most victims of violence know their attacker. So, the gender imbalance in intimate violence provides insight into the gender dynamics at play in the larger issues of violence against women. So, part of this we've really talked about a bit in this class are these explanations for rape. So there's different theoretical schools that offer different explanations for why they think rapes take place. Again, we talked about that it's simply a reproductive strategy, right? Which again, you could totally debunk with the fact that rape happens in prison, which is definitely not for reproduction. From psychology, that it's an individual act perpetrated by a sick pervert, right? That's kind of their perspective. And there's also that biological argument that men just lose control of themselves, right? Especially if you give them alcohol. But then there's this kind of easy counter to that argument as well. Well, then why don't women do that? How come you don't hear about women drinking too much and like overpowering and aggressively trying to dominate someone sexually? The idea is that these are just social justifications for the kind of inequalities we see within sexual scripts that justify aggression towards women as the norm, right? Again, I can't get that baby it's cold outside kind of reference out of my head because I keep hearing it when I'm walking in stores and things like that. And it's like the rapiest song ever. But it's part of our like American Christmas pop culture, right? Of this person like, I really can't stay. I really gotta go. And he just keeps like kind of forcing her to stay. But anyway, we'll get back to this. So there's some cultures that are what they call either rape free or rape prone. So, it really just depends on how normative rape is to that culture. So, in cultures where there's more egalitarian roles for women and more respect for women, they're relatively rape free. In cultures that are more repressive, where women don't have the same rights and opportunities as men, those cultures, typically are known to be more rape prone. So, the less respect for women a culture has, the more likely women are to be raped. So, this crime becomes regular and normalized in a lot of these cultures. And so, unfortunately, we are one of those cultures, right? The US has the highest rates of reported rapes in the industrialized world. In a lot of ways, we're rape prone because women are taught to avoid rape instead of men being taught to value and respect women sexually and not aggress, right? So, another issue is that, when we're talking about rape within the context of college and college campuses, the majority of those rapes that take place are acquaintance rapes. So there are varying degrees to the pressure many college women feel when it comes to having sex. Research found that 44% of college women surveyed experienced some forms of sexual activity when they didn't want to. 15% experienced attempted rape. 12% were coerced by drugs and alcohol. 25% had sex when they didn't want to, saying they were, quote, overwhelmed by their partner's arguments and pressures to have sex. And 9% were forcibly raped. Other researchers found up to 25% of college women experience completed or attempted rape during their college years. So this is why I like to really talk about the issue of enthusiastic consent, because it seems so obvious to me, but it's this idea that you have to be clear about consent. Like it can't just be something that oh yeah, I think so. I'm pretty sure. Or this person drank with me, or this person hung out with me, so therefore they consent, right? It's really not that simple. But this idea that, 25% of women within the survey said that they were overwhelmed by partners' arguments and pressure, meaning that she's sitting there not really wanting to do it, and he goes, "Come on, come on, come on." And after like a long time of that, she says, "Yes, that's not the same thing as consent, right? That's like coerced consent." She didn't say no, but she certainly didn't like, "Yeah, sure, great, that sounds awesome. Yes, 100%." Right? That's enthusiastic consent. If you ask someone, hey, do you want to do this? Yeah, for sure. Right? Like it would be like, how they have that consent tea analogy. It's like imagine like you're just inviting someone out to like go hang out or something. If you have to like, come on for an hour, they probably don't want to go out. They probably don't want to go out and hang out with you. You might get them to do it, but they probably didn't actually want to do it, right? So there is a difference between coercive and just actual enthusiastic consent. And that's something that we don't often talk about. So, in a lot of ways, we live in a rape culture. So, that's a culture that justifies rape and violence against women by delegitimizing their claims and blaming them for the actions that happen to them. So, this is also showing the fact that men who commit rapes are rarely prosecuted, which creates an environment where there's no accountability. So, if it is like it's not very deviant in our culture to rape, then some argue that it's really just simply overconforming to masculine sexual norms. So that, if the culture says men are supposed to dominate women, women are supposed to be sexually passive, men are supposed to be sexually aggressive, blah, blah, blah. When this actually happens, it's not as if someone's challenging the culture, they're overconforming to it. So some research has focused on men's thought processes when it comes to rape. So, for example, several surveys, many men indicated they would consider rape provided the conditions were right and they knew they would not get caught. So, one survey in the book found 20% of men indicated they would be likely to commit a rape and use force to have sex. 6% said they would, but not by force. And 30% said they might force, but would not rape, whatever that means. So, again, this is related to masculinity and that fact that men are judged on how many sex partners they have, right? Part of being a man, of being of a heteronormative, non-deviant sexual performance is, having sexual conquests in order to be considered real men. So we can see how it's almost overconforming, not being deviant, because it's normal to have this inequality in our sex roles. So, like we talked about before in class, rape is about power more than it's about sex. So, in the book, they talk about research on entitlement and how that relates to rape and rape culture. And, this idea that men often see women as teases who manipulate them with their feminine guiles, right? And so some men see rape as a form of retaliation. So revenge for making that guy feel bad, right? So because a woman may be sexual and attractive, but just not interested in a man, she can be considered a tease. So there's a quote from a participant in the book that shows the language of these narratives that some men think they deserve women. They feel powerless when they're rejected. This reminds me that SOB that shot up UC Santa Barbara sorority house, right? That piece of crap. He posted some manifesto online right before he murdered those women and said, that these stuck up bitches, that they're whores, but they won't go out with him, and how they will suffer for the crime of not finding him attractive. Right? Of course, that's an extreme. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say, like, oh, that's the baseline norm, because not at all. I'm just saying that, this idea of entitlement is very powerful when it comes to these notions of violence in the context of violence against women or sexual violence against women, right? Where some men feel like if they're rejected and they feel powerless, that they can regain that power if they sexually dominate a woman. So, this idea of I can take what I want because I'm more powerful. So, there's also, again, that kind of notion of the friend zone, which is a milder version of what that kind of, mass shooter psycho was trying to say. This idea that if you're friends with a person and, you know, it's typically like male to female in that kind of way. Like if a guy likes a girl and she puts him in the friend zone, that typically he's bummed because, he's sexually attracted to her. He wants to take it to the next level, but she only sees him as a friend. And so it's funny. I look at a lot of those fun internet-y kind of posts and Tumblrs and Reddits and the likes. And there was this one about this recently that I was just reading about like yesterday, and it kind of stuck in my head because it relates to this whole chapter. How this one guy said basically like if you respect those guy friends that are in that friend zone, then just cut them loose, right? And so this girl responded like, it's really not that easy. And that she explained like in her own personal experience how she told this guy like, hey, I know you like me. I'm sorry. I really like you as a friend, but I do not think of you that way. I'm not interested in you as a partner. I never will be, etc. Like super upfront with the dude like, hey, this is how this is going to be. Are you okay with it? And the guy was like, yeah, I'm fine with it. And she's like, are you sure? Because it's not going to happen, etc. Yeah, I'm totally fine with it. So it's like, what do you do in that situation? Do you just be like, no, you're not allowed to be friends with me? Like, no, there's a lot of girls that end up in that weird kind of situation with a unrequited, dude friend that wants to have sex with you, that it becomes this kind of like awkward, sad thing. And it's not often, because it's often characterized as these girls that manipulate guys. And I have known a few people just in life that really liked attention that they would get from some dudes. And so they would kind of languish it towards a couple of their male friends because it gave them, confidence and those kind of things. And I do think that that is a kind of cruel thing to do to anyone that likes you, to kind of in any way throw them a bone and make them feel like maybe there's a potential, right? So being upfront like this woman did was definitely the best way to handle that kind of situation. But it's this idea that, again, that just because you like someone doesn't mean that they should have to like you or that they should have to want to have sex with you, right? For women, this isn't as much a thing as it is for men in this kind of rape culture. It's not as if women feel as sexually entitled to men, right? As if you point at a person, you're like, yeah, I deserve to have sex with that dude, right? Because it's a very different power dynamic for women. Much more of the connection or the understanding that women have is based in emotion or, actually liking this person, like having some sort of like connection to that person more so than the physical. So it's not as much about that. But I don't know. It's interesting how, again, those are all on a spectrum. It's not as if there's one atypical case. And, you know, it's this idea that this does occur on kind of both sides of the spectrum. There's plenty of, heterosexual girls that have like crush on their dude friends and feel friend zoned. Like they can't move out of that area. But I feel like it's just the way that that word is used to kind of denote like, oh, girls are such bitchy teases. Oh, they friend zone me. What's the point of being a friend with a girl if I can't, put my junk in her? And it's like, that's the part that's so insulting of the logic, is this idea like, oh, well, the only reason I'm friends with this person is because I have a sexual / romantic interest in them. And that's not cool, right? That's not a good basis of like a decent, equitable friendship. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. I could talk about that all day. But yeah, this is being recorded, so I should probably hurry up. Okay, anyway. So this shows how rape is less of a problem of a small number of sick individuals and more of a social expectation problem when it comes to this male behavior that you're supposed to constantly be conquesting, right? So those expectations stem from gender inequality. So this disrespect and contempt that we have for women in society can push some men towards sexual predation. So marriage does not protect a woman from rape. 14 to 25% of women have reported being forced to have sex with their spouse. Some research shows that men are 3 times more likely to rape their wife than a stranger or acquaintance. So marital rape was long not considered a crime. It was considered part of your wifely duties, right? You're supposed to keep your husband happy. So this stripped women of any sexual autonomy. meaning that it turns her into kind of a thing, like a possession to be used when it's wanted. So, it is a crime to force sex, even if you're married to that person. Like, you don't get to just own a person, right? Oh, I exchanged a dowry and a cow, so here's my ownership of you, right? But unfortunately, there's a very strong relationship between marital rape and intimate partner violence or domestic violence within relationships. So, this is something that kind of goes in tandem with other forms of violence against women. So it's important to kind of understand how specifically sexual aspects of this violence manifest because of the cultural notions of what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a man, what it is to be heteronormative, etc. So, like, oh, God, I hate even bringing it up, but, like Trump's lawyer, right? Like his first wife um, sued him for rape, Trump, like back in the 90s. And she later dropped her charges. And basically, his lawyer, when someone asked about it like 2 years ago on the campaign trail, maybe it wasn't 2 years ago, it feels like 1,000 years ago now, um, when he was asked on the campaign trail, his lawyer was like, well, you can't rape your wife. And it's like, no, but you can, because that's what the law says. But anyway, so unfortunately, this is still kind of an issue when it comes to legal understandings today. So, where we need to focus some more analysis is on gender and its relationship to intimate partner violence. So, how are the social roles of man or woman affecting our understanding and beliefs about interpersonal violence, especially when it comes to either taking it seriously or considering it, oh, that's someone's personal family business, that's none of my business, right? This is most remarked upon within pedophilia. So, that's sexual arousal or predation of children by adults. Because of the widely talked about um, issues within the Catholic Church, people have often conflated or confused pedophilia with homosexuality, which is, of course, not the case. It's not about the gender of the child, it's the age that is related to the sexual um, proclivity, right? So it's the innocence, it's the age. So their marginalized, not adult status makes them sexually appealing to pedophiles. So early representations of homosexuals, though, tried to make this connection. Like there's this this horrible, horrible PSA I show in my sexualities course. It's like called "Boys Beware," and it talks about like it's supposed to be like perceptions of homosexuals, but in the 1950s, like they're just cruising parks, cruising for like young boys to like lure into their cars, right? So it kind of made this connection in that culture, and that really affected the kind of rights and understandings we had of homosexuals, especially when, before the Stonewall Uprising time period. So, gender symmetry assumes that women are just as likely to hit men as men are to hit women. And there, of course, are abusive women. We know that the rates of violence, though, are very one sided when it comes to DV and IPV. So there are men who face abuse. Some say they are underreported crimes, as male to female DV is often not taken seriously. The battered husband syndrome is this idea that societal constructions of masculinity as tough and impenetrable is counter to the need to call the cops because your spouse is hurting you, right? So it goes against our societal assumptions that men are naturally aggressive, women are naturally passive. So many men that are in these situations suffer in silence, um, because they don't want to report the crimes because they're not taken often very seriously as victims. I mean, women have a hard time being taken seriously as victims. So men, because it's such a gender reversed role, historically police did not take this very seriously. So the problem with the studies of this gender symmetry um, is that some of the studies find incredibly high rates of men being abused. And Kimmel argues this is an issue with the methodology of the research itself, specifically how the questions are worded, right? So who was asked what question, and even when people were asked also challenges the validity of the findings. So they were using the CTS, conflict tactics scale, which does not differentiate defensive violence from offensive violence. So that could kind of obviously skew that research. So domestic violence varies as the balance of power in the relationship shifts. So when all the decisions are made by one spouse, rates of spouse abuse are at the highest levels. Violence against women is most common in households where power is concentrated in the hands of the husband, which also works in the reverse but also in rare cases, right? And of course, this isn't something that's relegated to just one group of people. Violence against women is something that is experienced across class, race, and ethnic boundaries. There are some differences, as especially unemployment and socioeconomic, stressors are closely related to the onsets of violence. So, recent research has looked at same sex couples, finding that gay men and lesbians are more likely to be the victims of domestic violence than any um, anti gay hate crimes that they might face. So, they're just as likely to experience partner violence as heterosexuals. Uh, so, that's kind of a troubling issue that more research needs to kind of focus on this community and understand what are the issues that are leading to this violence. So ultimately, intimate partner violence is about power, right? It's about controlling and dominating another person. So, our kind of narratives and understandings in the culture and our understandings of masculinity and femininity that play into these roles of power are very important to analyze so that we can understand how to alleviate the consequences in this violence that result.